everyone. I think that we can start now. I would like, first of all, to welcome you to what is the first of a series of conferences that is being sponsored by the Women's Studies program and entitled Sexual Inequality, Why? And I'll have to admit that when the title was made, we had not realized that it was perhaps a different attitude than that which has been taken by the International Women's Year program. And I think as far as we're concerned, it's perhaps a little more positive than why not. Anyway, for those of you who are not from Sir George, I might just mention that the Women's Studies program is an interdisciplinary program. It is now possible to take a degree in Women's Studies as the only university in Quebec. And for those of you who are interested in finding out about this program, perhaps you might come and see us. There'll be all sorts of people to talk to at the reception. Before I introduce the speakers, I also would like to announce that immediately after the discussion, there will be a reception on the 7th floor in the Women's Lounge, and everyone is invited, and we hope that at that time you will have the opportunity to meet and discuss with the speakers personally. This reception, we're very honored to have the reception, and this is through the participation of the students of the Political Science Association. This evening, I have the honor of introducing to you Madame Laurette Robillard and Madame Caroline Pesteau, who are the President and Vice President of the Provincial Advisory Council on the Status of Women. This Advisory Council is a governmental body which was formed in 1973 for the purpose of advising the Prime Minister on all sorts of questions where women's rights were in particular very important. And it reports directly to the Cabinet and has among its members, if I'm not mistaken, several deputy ministers from the various, 8 deputy ministers from the various departments, so that hopefully the recommendations that the Provincial Advisory Council does give are being listened to with perhaps more attentive ears than they would otherwise. Certainly, the leadership of the Advisory Council has been very dynamic under Madame Laurette Robillard, and I will leave it to Madame Robillard and Madame Pesteau to explain the proposals that have been made by the Advisory Council. Some of you may know about their open line, telephone line. It's called Action Femmes, where women can phone in with any questions or problems they might have. I also have great pleasure in introducing to you our third speaker, who is Monique Simard, who is a collective bargaining advisor who participates in collective bargaining agreements for the CNTU. And hopefully she will be talking to us about the action and reaction of unions in the labor field and with reference to women. Perhaps if we can start off with Madame Robillard, I just might note that after the 3 speakers are finished, there will be a period for questions.
Hello. I'll give you an idea of the actual situation of women in employment in Canada and more particularly in Quebec. There's a fair amount of data and statistics. I will also give you a bird's eye view of the legislation in other provinces and in the U.S. and how far behind in that respect we are in Quebec. In that respect, in Quebec, the situation of women is somewhat behind, not so in other situations. Okay, I'll try to project my voice. I was depending on the...
I suspect the mics are fed directly into the, yeah.
The mics are not for the people. Okay. I had said that I would give you an expose, an explanation or some data on what the actual situation of women in the labor market in Canada and more particularly in Quebec, and a comparison of legislation elsewhere and the lack of legislation in Quebec. Is this better? In Canada, the women in the active population, women in the labor force, were 2,831,000 in 1972. Is this better now? They contribute to the gross national product of the country to a substantial amount, $3.5 billion. These gains, these earnings of women, translate themselves into the consumption of merchandise and services in income tax, and bring to them and to their family some measure of financial security. They also, the working women, participate to the social securities, the statutory social securities that the governments have instituted, such as unemployment insurance, which now insures maternity leave or gives some measure of security for maternity leave in Canada, in all the provinces. The women who work contribute to lighten the load of unemployment insurance contributions for all workers, all citizens, but their equal contributions to the Canada Pension Plan and the Quebec Pension Plan and to the Workmen's Compensation Fund do not bring to them the same equal benefits that they do to men. It is to be noted that since 1966, the Canada Pension Fund and the Quebec Pension Fund bring the working woman some measure of security for the age of retirement. This kind of security had not really been very frequent, or not very women had access to any kind of social security, particularly not any security earned by their earnings and by their contribution to the workforce. The private sector's pension plans have only really insured very, very thinly and a very small proportion of working women, and this for the numerous reasons that we can go into later. The number of working women in the province of Quebec has increased and has gone from a 461,000 in 1961 to 786,000 in 1973, which means an increase of 70% in 12 years. Out of these 786 women, 399, or half of the women in the workforce, in the labor market, half of them are married. The proportion of women in the age group between 16 and 64 years old is about 36%. These women workers are 1/3 of the actual labor force in Quebec, and about 28.4% of married women work. Although there's been this very fast increase in the participation of women to the labor force, they are still and always heavily concentrated into the lower earning classifications, lower earning levels of income. 81% of women in the labor force in Quebec earn less than $5,000 a year. 17% earn between $5,000 and $10,000 a year, and only 2% have an income which over $10,000 a year. Whereas 15% of the men in the labor force have an income of more than $10,000 a year. The reasons for the discrepancy in income between men and women are multiple, are very varied, but they are very much less surprising when we know and we find out, as we did by conducting a survey with the council, that 26% of collective bargaining agreements negotiated in the province of Quebec show different pay scales for men and women doing the same jobs. And you have to remember that a collective bargaining agreement is a contract between an employer, between the employers and the union, a contract that is registered with the government, and this contract should really, by any in any way, shape, or form, be deemed illegal, because we do have a discrimination against employment law in Quebec. We've had one for 1963, and these facts will go to show you how useless that law has been. In the manufacturing sector, the proportion of collective bargaining agreement that are discriminatory as far as the pay scales are concerned is about 42%. The differences between hourly salaries paid women and paid men in a number of sectors, in the industrial sectors, this proportion the disproportion goes on increasing over the years, and that's understandable when you think that most agreements, more collective bargaining agreements or negotiations, are usually based on a percentage increase. So any increase in percentage makes the difference between the unevenness between the salaries paid to the men and salaries paid to the women go on increasing all the time. Only 20% of the women in the labor force in Quebec are unionized, and Monique will tell you later, give you some more facts on that particular situation. All of this is, I suppose, should be surprising. I think some of the situation stems from the fact that generally it is still believed by most employers and managers, and I think probably by the union heads as well, that women work only for very secondary reasons. They work for a second income, they work for a very capricious reason, and this of course is not true. Women work for exactly the same reasons as men do, because they need the money to live by. And this, I think, is something where you do have to bring to the attention of employers of any parties that bargains salary contracts or any kind of agreement in employment. Married women come back to work, or they go on working, in order to maintain a certain level of standard of living in their family. For a forever increasing number of these families, the financial security, the financial equilibrium of the family budget depends on the income of both man and wife. The woman who returns to the labor market when she in her middle ages does it a number of times in order to make sure that she finally that she provides for her own financial security at retirement age. How many women who have, when they reach about their 40s or their late 30s, finally wake up and find out that their husband will not be able to afford a very comfortable or even a very decent retirement for themselves. going back to the labor market and contributing to the Quebec pension plan very often can make a significant difference. Also, the woman who goes back to work in her 40s, to that woman, the statistics will tell her that the chances that she will have an early widowhood, and that her husband's pension plan is very unlikely to have brought her to have brought him or her any kind of survival benefits, is also another incentive for the woman to join back to the labor force, and for the very same reason that the man needs a paycheck. One other aspect of the situation of the women in the labor force, and that is very often neglected or not brought to light very much by the management who sets up any kind of social or fringe benefits program. There are any number of women in the labor force who are head of families. Some of these are widowed, divorcees, separated, have been abandoned. They are single mothers, women whose husbands are students, women whose husbands are invalids, or whose husbands are chronically unemployed, sometimes unemployable. Single women who have the responsibility of elderly parents or of invalid sisters or brothers. In Quebec in 1969, there were 108,000 families who had a woman as the head of a family, and this meant one family out of every 12. The proportion of women who are head of families is about 1 out of 8 in the urban areas. The average income of these families is inferior to the average income of the regular type of family. In 1969, the average income of families headed by a man was $9,000. The average income of families headed by a woman was $6,000. This means that about half of the women employees in any given organization, the married women and the women who are head of families, have family responsibilities, and for some of them very important family responsibilities. We in the Quebec's Councils for the Status of Women made a survey of the actual situation of women in one of the largest employer in Quebec, the government of Quebec. The government of Quebec employs 47,000 employees. There is no written discrimination or no willful discrimination in the Quebec government, but the actual figures reveal a very flagrant, a very evident inequality. The women in the actual labor force and the actual number of employees in the Quebec civil service, there are number 30%. They are very massively in the classification of employment, which is called the fonctionnaire, and in the classification called fonctionnaire is where you find the clerks and the stenotypists and secretaries. Out of 32,000 male employees in the Quebec Civil Service, 42% of these are fonctionnaires. Out of 14,000 feminine employees, 90% of them are in this category of the fonctionnaire. At the highest hierarchy in the civil service, the management and the middle management, there are 5.5% men and 0.28% women. In the professional classifications, 18% men and 4% women. In these last classifications, in the management, middle management, and professional classifications. The Civil Service Commission advertises and is forever, usually carries on its rolls about 200 to 300 open positions for which they find no takers. The women are in the Quebec Civil Service just as massively grouped in the lower paid classifications of income. 76% of the women in the Quebec Civil Service earn less than $7,000 a year, and only 5% of them earn more than $10,000 a year. Only 28% of men earn less than $7,000 a year, and 43% of men in the Quebec Civil Service earn more than $10,000 a year. So without having a graph in front of you, you can see that the graph for men and the graph for women are absolutely lopsided. This state of affairs with a large and important and responsible employer is not very surprising. You, I'm sure, would take a study of Hydro-Quebec, of the Bell Telephone, of the CNR, of Domtar, and find probably figures that would be very closely approximate to the ones I have just quoted to you. We think, all feminist women think, that this massive stereotyping of roles in employment is, and this fact that women are so heavily in the lower categories of employment is really a very bad utilization of human resources in our society. And yet our government is worried about a possible penury of manpower in the next 5 or 10 years. In the US and in Canada, you are probably aware that recent laws have been aimed at changing and at revising these situations. In the U.S., in 1972, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act amended the Civil Rights Act, and this law for equality in employment of minorities and women has provoked some very profound changes in personnel policies with most American employees. The commission that which administers this law which is very coercive, has extended powers, and you have heard about the judgments which have forced employers to pay back damages in several millions of dollars for employees, women employees and minority employees who had simply not had access to all classifications of employment and all possibilities of promotion. In Canada, there will be in Ottawa a Civil Rights Act introduced into the House of Commons, which will prohibit discrimination in employment based on sex, age, marital status, and other discrimination, other reasons for discrimination, and very probably the labor code will be changed. This project, this bill, should affect, when it becomes law, the personal policies of that are actually practiced by employers, which are submitted to the Federal Control, Communications, in Transportation, and Banking. The law in Ottawa, which was introduced by Marc Lalonde, called the Omnibus Bill, will change some dispositions, some of the provisions of the unemployment insurance law concerning maternity leaves, and it will afford maternity leaves of a more flexible nature for women who leave their job to have a baby, and they will then be able to come back later and leave later. There will be there is also a bill affecting the Civil Service Act, and the Canada Pension Plan will eliminate the provisions for different survival benefits to women contributing to the Canada Pension Plan. The same advantages, the same benefits will be given to anyone, a man or a woman contributing to the pension plan. There are laws in every province in Canada prohibiting discrimination in employment. In British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland, these provisions are within Human Rights Code of various names. In Saskatchewan, it is administered by a law on fair employment standards. These laws render illegal any discrimination in employment. Most of them decree non-discrimination provisions for most or for some measures of the any personnel administration function. They regulate the activities of placement agencies, recruiting in job offers, in employment, and in hiring and firing, in salaries, in employment conditions, and in fringe benefits, as well as training and promotion. In New Brunswick, recently, some very, very definitive directives were issued informing employers and the public of the interpretation that the Human Rights Commission would give to any discriminatory complaints or complaints of discrimination with regards to fringe benefits in any private plans. Recently in Ontario, similar directives were issued, and these directives had been awaited by employers for a while. This means that these laws and changes of laws to the laws in Ontario particularly affect directly a proportion of the labor force in Quebec, and this means that a large number of pension plans and insurance plans, collective insurance plans or group insurance plans for employee benefits in companies have been changed. The Royal Bank has made some very substantial changes to its benefit plans to employees, and this is an area that is not all that extraordinary in appearance, but is very important to the security of employees, whether they are aware of it or not. A very large part of the fringe benefits program until very recently, and certainly are a very large number of them still are very discriminatory to women. Most of these directives decree that employee benefits afforded to employees will be programmed according to the actual needs of the employees, not according to their sex. And these laws, which affect some very major changes in fringe benefits practices, finally confirms or recognize the principle of the interdependence, financial interdependence of salaried spouses. And it will hopefully finally affect the attitude of management, which has always considered that only men have financial responsibilities and that women always work for a laugh or for a lark. The new laws will affect, as I have just demonstrated, all the labor force and all the workers, men and women, in other provinces of Canada, but not yet in Quebec, where the situation remains the same, and where until the Quebec Council on the Status of Women came into existence, not one step, not one move had been made in that direction. The only change likely to come about so far might come about under the Human Rights Code introduced in Parliament. The Council very definitely has other idea on the matters, and I think Caroline Pesteau now was about ready to give you the essence of the recommendations we have made, and which are will be out in the public early next week, recommendations which have been accepted in principle by the Labour Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame Robillard. I think those of us who weren't aware of the situation certainly have had our eyes opened right now. Just before Madame Pesteau takes over, I would just like to mention that those who are interested in receiving a text of Madame Robillard's speech, there's a paper that is being circulated. Just please put down your name and your address, and Madame Robillard will have the text with the various figures, which perhaps may be interesting to some people. I'll have that sent to you. Thank you. Madame Pesteau.
Thank you very much. I must say I'm very grateful to Laurette that she's left me the more cheerful part of the discussion, because it really is extremely depressing when one thinks about those figures. And we were pretty depressed at our first meeting, although we didn't have all the figures, but we knew pretty well what it was going to be like when we got them. We've had our first meeting in Quebec, the members of the Council on the Status of Women, in December of '73, and at that moment we drew up a series of priorities, and as regards the working woman, which was one, our attention was immediately drawn to the problems facing the working woman, and we had really, I think, three priorities to try and outlaw discrimination in general, the whole idea of sex typing in jobs, and to ensure that there was equal pay for equal work, but not just in the narrowest kind of definition that you can avoid by reclassifying the job and giving the man just a little something extra to do, or the woman just a little something different to do, so that you can pay them different scales. Real equal pay for equal work is defined by the International Labour Organization, which is equal pay for work requiring equal responsibilities and equal skills under equal circumstances. And it's very important, incidentally, to define this, because if you just put down equal pay for equal work, well, there was that famous example in the Bird report of the male and female janitor, and the female janitor didn't have to put the garbage bin outside the door, she had to leave it inside, and the man had to carry it a couple of feet outside, and he was paid more because it was a different job. We mustn't let ourselves be fooled by job classifications. And then our third priority as regards working women was to make sure that they had the right to maternity leave, which hasn't always been the case in Quebec. At the moment, we are living under a kind of special dispensation, in the sense that we are getting paid maternity leave through the Unemployment Insurance Commission. But this isn't really yet enshrined in Quebec, either custom or law. And so it's extremely important that a maternity leave, to start with, be granted, and afterwards to make sure that we do keep the right to some kind of financial benefit, whether it comes from unemployment insurance or some other source, during maternity leave. So these were the things we started looking at. And we first looked at the government as an employer, and as Laurette has shown, the government hasn't got a very good track record, although there's no explicit discrimination in the government hiring policies or promotional pay policies. And so we set up a task force to see what could be done about this, and we came up with a program of equality of opportunity in the public service in Quebec, which was accepted and endorsed by the Prime Minister Bourassa in September of '74. This program is now starting to be implemented. Of course, it takes a very long time because you have to educate both sides of the employees and the employer, where they're going to use audiovisual techniques. They're going to go through the personnel records and try and see who would be interested in promotion, and try and make sure that the selection committees are open to the idea. There's no point in encouraging women to apply if the selection committees aren't ready to hire them, and in general get something moving as an example to the rest of the employers in Quebec, both private and public, or para-public, because of course the government is the public employer, of what can be done, what should be done in the field of personnel improvement, female personnel improvement programs. But of course, this isn't sufficient, because although the public service is a major employer, it's far from being the only one. And so, simultaneously, without waiting for the public service program to be accepted, we started working on updating the law against discrimination in employment, which exists in Quebec, as Laurette said, for the last 9 years or so, but in fact was totally inefficient, and some lawyers said that it was ultra vires, and even had it in fact been fully constitutional, fines ranged from $25 to $100. There was no protection against reprisals from the employer, and the woman had to bring her own case, and the whole question of the appeals wasn't spelled out in any way at all. She had to apply to the Minimum Wage Commission, which is overburdened with work, and which isn't really very much assistance in this field. And so this law, obviously, from the figures we've heard, was of absolute no use at all. And so we soon gave up the idea of reforming this law and worked out a series of proposals to ensure equality for women in the labour force in the province. And we've gone back and forth between various government departments, making quite sure that we've cleared them in principle, and that there are no major objections in principle. There are no problems that we haven't thought about. I mean, of course, there are a series of problems because people are going to have to change their way of thinking, and there are certain things that are going to have to disappear, but that there are no obstacles that we haven't thought about that people can spring on us. And the Minister of Labour, Mr. Cornvoyer, agreed on the 17th of September that in principle he was in favour of our proposals. But of course, being in favour in principle doesn't always mean that it's going to be in practice very soon, particularly when one's very busy, as the Quebec government have been recently. And so it's extremely important that we get the maximum feedback and support for what we're trying to get the government to initiate, because we can't propose legislation to start with. We are not a ministry. We can't introduce legislation into the National Assembly, and particularly legislation which pertains to the Department of Labour obviously should be introduced by the Minister of Labour. So I'm going to talk about some of the provisions that are included in our recommendations. We haven't got enough, unfortunately, English copies of this to be circulated, but it will soon be available to the public, and I think we'll be able to leave a certain number of copies behind, which perhaps the students who require them for the course could copy or share with each other. Now, some of the most important provisions that we're recommending well, real wage parity, as I was saying at the beginning, not just equal pay for equal work. It's interesting that in the Bill 50 that Jérôme Choquette brought down before Christmas, he just had equal pay for equal work, but that isn't sufficient. There are many other things that aren't sufficient in that either, as regards equality of women. But as I said before, that's not sufficient. Also, there will be no exceptions, because in many of these anti-discrimination legislations, there are an awful lot of exceptions. Agricultural workers are accepted, professional bodies can discriminate, charities can very often discriminate, and a series of things like that. Another thing is that the burden of proof will lie with the employer. That is to say that if a woman shows that she is receiving less for a similar job than a man, the employer will have to say why this is, whether it's because they're both on piecework, or whether it's because she's got the man's got seniority, or what factor it may be, because there are, after all, some things which do justify two people receiving a different wage. If you're on piecework, well, then it's going to be the one who does the most work. That's fair dues from the start. But it's up to the employer to show where the inequality is. I mean, what justifies the inequality. It's not up to the woman to prove it, which it has been up to now. And also, this will automatically entail the invalidity, the nullity of all collective agreements, of which there are, 47% in the manufacturing sector, which have different pay scales for the same or similar work. As regards discriminatory practices in the labour market, it'll outlaw all discriminatory practices in advertising, in hiring procedures, in access to promotion, further training. I mean, as you must all know, it's sometimes very hard to get on the training course, which is a prerequisite for a certain promotion. And so you may say, fine, we're not refusing any women, but in fact no women turn up because no women have been allowed on the training course. And similarly, all types of fringe benefits will be covered by this. As regards maternity leave, it will ensure 16 weeks of leave, and with a flexibility to correspond to the amendments being made to the maternity leave provisions in the Unemployment Insurance Act in Ottawa, which will allow the woman to take her maternity leave more flexibly as it suits her, whereas at the moment it's just about laid down. If she doesn't take it at a certain time, she misses it. Also, of course, it'll prohibit discrimination on grounds of pregnancy. You may not believe this, but this still does take place quite commonly, and guarantee the same or equivalent position on returning after childbirth, and also keeping the social benefits, the fringe benefits that pertain to her job before she left and that she's accumulated. What is also very important is that we want provisions for the application of these principles, because it's all very well having principles, but unless it's really spelled out how you're to go and get your equality of opportunity in the labour force, there'll be an awful lot of women who won't go and get it. And after all, one can't continually be pushing them and asking them, wouldn't you like to bring a lawsuit against the Royal Bank or the Sun Life or something? Obviously, there's an enormous educational effort to be done, but also you need it spelled out very clearly how to go and get what you're due. And so there's a procedure for complaints, and there's a procedure for appeals. There's group action possible in our provision. This is very, very important, obviously, as we've learned from the examples in the States. And up to now, there hasn't been any provision for group action in Canadian law, but Bill 50, that's one of its good points, does introduce the possibility of group action, class action, into the Canadian system, and that's a very good precedent, and there'll certainly be provision for group action in our recommendations. And there'll be a possibility for the woman to bring a civil suit if she's refused by the Department of Labour Tribunal. If she thinks she's still got a good enough case, she'll be able to go and bring a civil suit. Of course, this is much more complicated, but it does give someone who is really determined on her, to get her rights and thinks she's right, another alternative. Now then, I think those are probably the main provisions that we are suggesting and which we hope will go through. And I think there will be some quite important consequences, but as Laurette was suggesting, a whole lot of companies, both federally incorporated companies or trans-provincial companies that are incorporated in Ontario, for example, and work in Quebec or in other provinces, have already thought about this. And there are a number of companies that are implementing female personnel promotion campaigns and so on. A certain division of Shell Canada is, certain Bell's supposed to be, Bank of Canada, Royal Bank definitely is, and some of these are doing something about it. So really, in a way, part of the work will be done. And I think that this is an important element, because otherwise in a way we're starting from scratch, because there's nothing really on the statute books that's any good in Quebec. But on the other hand, we're not starting from scratch in the sense that I think the public opinion is getting increasingly fed up and with this discriminatory situation, and the companies themselves, the larger, better informed companies, are realizing that they're going to have to face up to this problem sooner or later. So it might as well be sooner. And so that is why we think it's extremely important to get these recommendations accepted by the Cabinet and the National Assembly as soon as possible. I think I'll stop here, because I could go on talking about what we want to produce as for a long time, but perhaps there'll be questions about things that I haven't mentioned and which we can deal with later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madame Pesteau. Well, now that we've seen perhaps certainly some of the positive recommendations, and I must say my mood has certainly lifted, perhaps Monique, and now you can tell us what the workers have been doing themselves, or what perhaps in the movements that have been developed, what they've been permitted to do for themselves as women.
Tonight I address myself to you not as an official representative of the CNTU. For people who do not know what the CNTU is, it's one of the three major labor movements in Quebec, which groups 200,000 workers, where there is about 50% of women that are members of the union. Why have this distinction? I am a militant and working as a negotiator for the CNTU, but why not an official representative of the CNTU on women questions? Well, because though having progressed a lot, the labor movement has not given to women their complete representativity in its structures and formation. We must say, though, that the CNTU has supported and negotiated such demand as desexualization of classification, which means why our secretaries are almost always women, why are textile workers always women, why are laundry workers always women, equal pay for equal work, of course, daycare centers for children, for working women, free daycare centers, and adequate maternity leaves of absence for working women. But why is the women not fully representative in the movement, labor movement? We have to go back in the Quebec society to understand this. I will not give any statistics or examples of the questions I will answer. Maybe can give you some practical examples. As you all know, the Quebec society was a very traditional and Catholic society, centered around mother, father, and children, which had very definite roles. Women were confined to be mothers and nothing else, and she could not be permitted to leave behind her children and husband and not to go to work. It was up to the 1950s in the French-Canadian population of Quebec an act of treason to go to work and leave children and husband behind, where women were baby makers, and the more they made, the more glorified they were. And as long as Quebec was a rural society, there was no problem. But the economic situation changing and Quebec becoming industrial and urban society, women had no choice. They had to go to work in order to survive, not because they wanted to, because there were very bad conditions of work and very bad pays, but they had to go to work. So these women not only were forced to work in these conditions, but had to endure the pressure and disapproval of the whole society. The labor movement, notably the CNTU, which was the authentic and truly Quebec labor movement, which was separated from the North American labor movement, supported exactly the same values as towards women working. Even if it always has been a very militant labor movement, it was very eager to fight for better conditions and better salaries for men. The movement and labor movement would not hear of women working, and this was up till the 1950s. Women had to stay home and make babies to make militants when they would get older if there were boys. And would not accept that women would have a place on the labor market. If we go back into the official positions, all the demands concerning women were concerning women staying at home. They should get more as family allocations, etc. But nothing for the ones working. So men were invited to be militant and fighters. Women were invited to stay home, make babies, future militants, and support morally their husband. But of course, things have changed, and there's an economic reality that the society had to accept, and that the labor movement also had to accept. And it became also a reality that more and more women were on the working market and were becoming an important part of the labor class and labor movement. The percentage of unionized women was very low up to the 1960s. But during the 1960s, a massive organization of public and para-public employees, where the majority of them were women, hired very much the percentage of women workers. At the same time, the labor movements in Quebec radicalized very much their political orientation, but left apart the feminine questions, not talking still about women staying at home, but completely silent about it. But the presence of these newly organized women and these newly militants adds its manifestation in the movement, so that men members could no longer ignore their presence and their demands, and could no longer reject the women as equal partners in a labor battle, in a long-term labor battle for the labor class. We're right now still in this situation. For the past 10 years, this has been the situation. Women are more and more organized into the union movement. If we look at the percentage of the newly organized industries or newly organized sectors, we see that a majority of them are composed by women. But the presence of these women, like I've just told you, has a certain effect. But we can still feel the traditional values in the labor movement, both on the part of men and women. This can be very clearly seen by their participation into the structures of the labor movement. At the local level, in the specific working area, the participation of women into the labor movement is fully representative to their proportion. So there is a militancy on the part of women in the labor movement. But as you reach the higher levels of any labor organization, you can only see the almost complete absence of women, while the number of members is almost as equal. Why this? A lot of examples, a lot of reasons. Women have less time to be a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week militant. They are scared, etc. But I think the most important reason is probably that even though having disponibility disadvantages, women still fear the subtle disapproval of a labor organization still composed of a majority of men. And also these men would rather vote for a male candidate to represent them than a female candidate. But women are militant, and they should be, because they are still, what our two companions just said, they must be militant and they must fight for better working conditions and highest paid and total equality in the labor market and in the society. They do, but as a local level, and most of the time much better than men when they decide to. The majority of women working are part of a lower economic class. Their need to be organized and to fight is even greater than one of men. And they must join the labor. For the ones who are not organized, they must join the labor movement in order to get better conditions and also to change the orientation of the labor movement on this question. Still, we have between only 20 and 30% of the manpower, women manpower unionized, while 45% of the men working power is unionized. And also the sectors of economic activity where the women workers are employed are still the lowest paid and the worst working conditions we can find. And the best example of that is the textile workers still. But the greatest problem is probably because of the sexualization of employment. And this has started from the time women have gone out to work up to this time. Nothing has changed on that question. Some things have been obtained. When the maternity leaves, they're not perfect, have been obtained. In some areas, equal pay for equal work has been obtained. But the root of the problem is the sexualization of employment. Some jobs are only for men, some jobs are only for women. And the basic requirement is one of sex, so you cannot get out of it. And this you will find in every kind of industry, private, public, or para-public, you will find it. And to us, the most important thing to attack at this point is this aspect. And both men and women should attack it, because it attacks also men. They are sexualized in some employments. They are favorized towards women, but they are still victims of this sexualization of employment. And they should join together and fight that. The attitude of management and employers has always been to divide a group of workers. And the most successful division has always been the one between men and women. And we must say it, the labor movements has approved it for many years by its silence and not talking about it. But anyhow, the changes have begun, have involved women more and more in the labor organization, and have been an element that has contributed very much, that it has progressed on many things, not only on the question of women, but also on a total analysis of the society in general. If one must change the society, if one wants to change it and its pattern, economic pattern, it cannot exclude the situation and the problem of women, not only the ones at work, but the ones at home also. The labor organization have, for many years, as you must know, radicalized itself and have had more definite orientations. They will succeed or not succeed, but they will surely not succeed if they do not look at the problem and give complete and total equality to women at every point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monique. There's just something I'd like to mention. Monique said that the CNTU is made up of 50% women, and Monique happens to be one of 9 women who in turn is 9 of 150, I think, 200 permanent labor advisors working for the CNTU. So if you can see that perhaps the CNTU hasn't done too much, maybe their priorities are not geared in the right way yet. All right, those who have questions, could you just perhaps stand up and I guess shout your question to the person that you'd like to answer it?
I have 2 or 3 questions, depending if you decide one. One thing is that, for example, you were with the Conseil de la Femme and Simard. I would like to know if...
Français n'est pas ici ce soir.
C'est pas un bout de Laurette. Alors, for the Conseil de la Femme, has it been established just for the International Women's Year, or is it going to go on?
The Conseil du Statut de la Femme has a statutory existence. It was created by a law approved in Parliament in July '73. It's the only council in Canada that has legal existence, guaranteed by law.
So it will go on.
Yes. International Women's Year is like Mother's Day. It